General David Carter stood in front of his modest suburban home, taking a deep breath as he absorbed the tranquil surroundings. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets, lined with well-kept lawns and rows of trees. This neighborhood, nestled on the outskirts of a bustling city, had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of the world and reconnect with his family. After serving multiple tours overseas, leading troops into battle, and making countless decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience, this was exactly what he needed: peace, solitude, the comforting sense of normalcy. It was a far cry from the intensity of military life, where every day was unpredictable, and each moment carried the potential for life or death. Here, in this peaceful suburb, life moved at a slower pace. The biggest concern, on most days, was the neighbor's dog digging up the flower beds, or whose turn it was to host the neighborhood barbecue. David had lived here for years with his wife, Sheila, and their 2 children. When he wasn't deployed, he cherished the moments he spent with them, playing in the backyard, going for evening walks, and enjoying the simple pleasures of family life. Though his role as a high-ranking Army general required great responsibility, when he was home, he was just Dad and Honey, titles he held dear, perhaps more than any military medal or honor he had earned. He had served his country with distinction for over 2 decades. He'd seen the best and the worst of humanity during his time in the military: camaraderie, bravery, sacrifice, and on the other hand, brutality, hatred, and violence. But through it all, he had remained steadfast, his integrity unshaken, his commitment to service unwavering. Now at 48, David was thinking about winding down his career. Retirement was on the horizon, and he looked forward to spending more time in this serene neighborhood, far from the battlefield, focusing on his family and perhaps mentoring young soldiers. As he stood on his front lawn, watching the sun dip lower, David smiled to himself. Life was good. His military service was almost behind him, and the future held promise. A future of relaxation, family dinners, and finally, peace. But as fate would have it, that peace would be short-lived. The next day, David decided to go for a walk. It was something he did often to clear his mind. He had developed the habit during his deployments, when moments of solitude were rare but deeply treasured. Walking had always helped him think, to process the world around him. And now, it had become part of his routine in civilian life as well. David donned a casual outfit, jeans, and a plain black t-shirt, and set out down the sidewalk. He greeted a few neighbors as he passed, exchanging polite waves and smiles. The air was warm, and the faint sound of children playing echoed from a nearby park. Everything seemed perfectly normal. As David rounded a corner, heading toward a quiet residential street, he noticed a patrol car parked on the side of the road. Officer Kyle Thompson, a relatively young police officer known for being a stickler for the rules, sat inside, sipping on his coffee. Thompson had been with the local police department for about 5 years, but he had already earned a reputation for his aggressive approach to law enforcement, especially when it came to people of color in the community. David paid little attention to the patrol car at first. He had nothing to hide, and besides, he was just taking a walk. But as he passed by, he couldn't help but notice the way Officer Thompson was watching him, his eyes narrowing as if trying to size him up. It was a look David had seen before, all too often in his life, even as a man of his stature and accomplishments. Suddenly, David heard the familiar sound of a car door opening and the thud of boots hitting the pavement. He turned to see Officer Thompson approaching him with a brisk, purposeful stride. David stopped, his heart sinking slightly, knowing exactly where this was headed. He'd seen this kind of thing play out many times before. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Thompson called out, his tone clipped and authoritative. David stood still, his hands casually at his sides, his military training keeping him calm and composed. "Yes, officer," he replied evenly, making sure to keep his voice respectful. He had learned long ago that calmness was often the best defense in situations like these. "I need to ask you a few questions," Thompson said, stopping a few feet away from David. His hand rested on his utility belt, near his holstered weapon, as if he was preparing for trouble. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" David blinked, momentarily taken aback by the question. It was his neighborhood. He had lived here for years, owned his home, paid his taxes. He'd raised his children here. But the officer's tone suggested that, in Thompson's eyes, David didn't belong. "I'm just out for a walk," David answered, keeping his voice level. "I live just a few blocks down." Thompson's eyes narrowed even further, as if he didn't believe him. "I haven't seen you around here before. What's your address?" David's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained calm. He could feel the tension rising. He knew this wasn't about a simple misunderstanding. It was about something far deeper, something that had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. Racial profiling. "I don't think that's necessary," David replied. "I'm not doing anything wrong. Just taking a walk in my own neighborhood." That didn't sit well with Officer Thompson. His expression hardened, and his posture became more aggressive. "Look, I'm asking you a simple question. Just tell me your address, and we'll be done here." David sighed inwardly. He could see where this was going, and part of him wanted to just walk away. But he knew that would escalate the situation even further. Instead, he said, "I don't think there's any need for this. I haven't broken any laws, and I'm not causing any trouble." Thompson's face flushed with anger. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" he snapped, his hand inching even closer to his weapon. David, sensing the danger, took a deep breath. "Officer, I'm not refusing anything. I'm just asking you to treat me like you would anyone else in this neighborhood." But that was precisely the problem. In Officer Thompson's eyes, David wasn't just anyone. He was a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, and that, to Thompson, was enough to raise suspicion. Without warning, Thompson reached for David's arm, grabbing him forcefully. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Thompson ordered. David's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, a familiar sensation from his years on the battlefield. But this wasn't a combat zone, and Officer Thompson wasn't an enemy soldier. Yet the situation felt just as hostile. "Officer, you're making a mistake," David said firmly, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anger rising within him. Thompson, however, wasn't listening. In his mind, he had already made his decision. He saw David as a threat, as someone who didn't belong, and he was determined to assert his authority. With a swift motion, he twisted David's arm behind his back and slapped handcuffs onto his wrists. David winced as the cold metal cuffs dug into his skin. The scene was unfolding so quickly, and yet it felt painfully slow. A small group of onlookers had gathered nearby, some with their phones out, recording the encounter. He could hear murmurs of disbelief from the crowd, but no one stepped in. They all knew better. Interfering with the police often made things worse. "Is this really necessary?" David asked, through gritted teeth as Thompson pushed him toward the squad car. Thompson didn't respond. He shoved David into the back of the car, slammed the door, and stood there for a moment, staring at the gathered crowd, as if daring anyone to speak up. As the police car sped away, the small crowd of onlookers remained frozen, unsure of how to react. A few people murmured in disbelief, their eyes wide with shock at what they had just witnessed. General David Carter, a decorated hero, had been treated like a common criminal, arrested in broad daylight, without cause, and with an unnecessary level of force. But what some had initially seen as a tragic, yet all too common case of racial profiling soon took on a life of its own. One young man, standing off to the side of the scene, lowered his phone after recording the entire encounter. His name was Malik, and he had been walking home from his job when he saw the interaction unfold. Though hesitant at first, Malik had felt compelled to capture the moment on video. Something about the way Officer Thompson had approached General Carter set off alarm bells in his mind. It wasn't just a routine stop. It was laced with an aggression that Malik had seen too many times before in his own life. With shaky hands, he watched the video he had just recorded, replaying the moment when Thompson grabbed Carter and slammed him into the patrol car. It was hard to believe this kind of thing was still happening, especially to a man who had served his country with such distinction. Malik felt a growing anger rise within him. This wasn't just wrong. It was a symbol of everything people like him had been fighting against for years. Without a second thought, Malik posted the video to his social media accounts, captioning it with a brief but powerful statement. "This is what being black in America looks like, even when you're a U.S. Army general." He hit send, not knowing that his actions would spark a nationwide movement within hours. As the video began to spread, first among his friends, then to broader networks, it caught the attention of activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike. The footage of a respected general being racially profiled and wrongfully arrested struck a deep nerve. It wasn't long before the hashtag #WhyJustice4Carter began trending, and within hours, the video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. News outlets quickly picked up the story, featuring the video in their broadcasts, and the incident became a lightning rod for conversations about race, policing, and justice. Journalists began digging into General Carter's background, highlighting his numerous accolades, including his tours of duty in conflict zones, his leadership, and his dedication to serving his country. People were appalled that someone who had given so much to the nation could be treated with such disrespect and disregard simply because of his skin color. Protests erupted across the city, and then in cities across the country. People of all races took to the streets, holding signs demanding justice for General Carter and calling for reform in policing. "No justice, no peace," they chanted as they marched through the streets, their voices loud and unwavering. The arrest became a symbol of the broader struggle against systemic racism and police brutality. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the countless others who had been subjected to similar treatment without the benefit of a viral video to tell their story. As the protests grew, so did the pressure on the local police department. Officer Kyle Thompson, the man at the center of it all, was suddenly under the spotlight in a way he had never imagined. For years, he had seen himself as a tough, no-nonsense cop who didn't bend the rules for anyone. But now, he was being painted as a racist villain, the face of a corrupt and discriminatory system. Thompson had thought little of the arrest at the time. To him, it was just another day on the job, another suspicious person to question. He had assumed the man walking down the street was just another local troublemaker, someone who didn't belong in the neighborhood. He hadn't recognized General Carter, not that it would have made a difference to him in the heat of the moment. Thompson believed he was simply following protocol, doing what he thought was necessary to maintain order. But as he sat in the precinct later that night, scrolling through his phone and seeing the flood of news coverage and social media posts condemning his actions, a sinking feeling began to take hold in his gut. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't anticipated that the man he arrested was not only a well-respected general, but someone the public would rally behind so fiercely. The more he read, the more he realized the gravity of the situation. People were calling for his resignation. Some demanded that he be charged with misconduct or even assault. The department was receiving calls non-stop from reporters, activists, and angry citizens demanding justice. Thompson could feel the walls closing in around him. His superiors had already called him into a meeting earlier in the day, questioning him about the details of the arrest, the use of force, and why he had detained Carter in the first place. It was clear that they were looking for a way to distance themselves from the fallout. Thompson's initial defensiveness slowly gave way to something else: fear. The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the image of General Carter's face during the arrest. The calm dignity in his eyes as Thompson cuffed him. The way he had politely tried to defuse the situation, even as the officer escalated it. And now, the world knew about it. In the days that followed, as the protests grew louder and the pressure mounted, Thompson found himself questioning everything. His once steadfast belief in his own righteousness began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. He started to see that this wasn't just about him and Carter. It was about something much bigger, something he had never fully understood before. The system that had empowered him, the authority he wielded so confidently, was deeply flawed. And for the first time in his career, he was forced to confront his own role in perpetuating that system. The pivotal moment came when Thompson was ordered to meet with General David Carter. The meeting, arranged by the police department in a desperate attempt to quell public outrage, was meant to be a step toward reconciliation. But for Thompson, it felt more like walking into a storm. David Carter, now released from custody after intense media scrutiny, agreed to the meeting, though he had no illusions about what it would entail. He had been through enough in his life to know that this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. The public was watching, and if there was any chance to turn this moment into something meaningful, he had to be willing to face his adversary. The meeting took place in a small, nondescript room at the police department. Thompson sat at the table, fidgeting with his hands, while David Carter entered the room with quiet authority. His presence was commanding, not because of his rank, but because of the calm dignity he exuded, even in the face of injustice. For a few moments, neither man spoke. The air in the room was thick with tension. Finally, Carter broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "You made a mistake," Carter said, looking Thompson directly in the eyes. "A mistake that goes beyond just me." Thompson, still grappling with his own defensiveness, opened his mouth to speak, but Carter continued before he could form the words. "I've faced enemies on battlefields, fought in wars that many wouldn't survive," Carter said, his voice steady. "But what you did, the way you treated me, is part of a different kind of war. One that people like me have been fighting our whole lives. A war where our dignity, our humanity, is constantly under attack." Thompson felt a lump in his throat. He had never heard it put that way before. He had never considered what his actions meant on such a profound level. "You didn't just arrest me," Carter went on. "You assumed that because of the color of my skin, I didn't belong. You saw me as a threat before you even knew who I was. And that's what's wrong. Not just with you, but with the system that trained you to think that way." Thompson sat in silence, unable to argue. He could feel the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. For the first time, he realized that it wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about the years of conditioning that had led him to that moment. "I'm not asking for an apology," Carter said, leaning forward slightly. "What I'm asking is that you start to see, really see, understand what your actions mean, not just for me, but for every black man and woman who has been treated like a suspect first and a person second." Thompson's face flushed with shame. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He had thought of himself as a protector, someone who enforced the law for the greater good. But now, sitting across from General Carter, he saw the deeper truth. He wasn't just upholding the law. He was upholding a system built on deeply ingrained prejudices. I didn't know," Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter looked at him for a long moment before replying. "That's the problem. Too many people don't know. But now you do. And the question is, what are you going to do about it?" The words hung in the air, heavy and profound. Thompson didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in his life, he understood that something had to change. In the days that followed, Thompson resigned from the police force. The public pressure had become too much, and deep down, he knew that he could no longer serve in the same way. He couldn't go back to being the officer he once was, but his journey was far from over. Surprisingly, it was David Carter who reached out to Thompson after the resignation. Carter, despite everything he had endured, believed in the power of redemption. He knew that Thompson wasn't beyond saving. If anything, Thompson represented the very change Carter had been fighting for. If people like Thompson could learn, grow, and become allies in the fight for justice, then there was hope. Under Carter's guidance, Thompson began to educate himself on issues of race and justice. He attended community meetings, read books, and listened to the voices of those who had been marginalized. It was a slow, painful process of unlearning years of ingrained biases, but Thompson was determined to change. And as he worked toward his own redemption, Thompson became a vocal advocate for police reform. He spoke at rallies, admitting his past mistakes and calling for systemic changes within law enforcement. He used his platform to educate other officers, hoping to prevent them from making the same errors he had made. Meanwhile, David Carter's leadership continued to grow. He had transformed from a victim of injustice into a national figure for racial justice and police reform. The protests that had erupted in the wake of his arrest had turned into a full-fledged movement, and Carter was at the forefront, leading the charge for change. Together, though from very different paths, both men had found a way to turn a moment of injustice into a catalyst for progress. As the days passed and the movement grew, General David Carter found himself at the heart of a national conversation on racial justice and police reform. What had begun as a deeply personal moment of humiliation and injustice had evolved into something much larger, a catalyst for real, meaningful change. David had never sought the spotlight for himself. He had always preferred to lead by example, quietly and with dignity. But now, circumstances had thrust him into the role of a public figure, and he knew he had a responsibility to use his voice for those who had been silenced for too long. The viral video of his wrongful arrest had sparked protests across the country. People from all walks of life, from major cities to small towns, took to the streets, demanding accountability from law enforcement and an end to racial profiling. What made this moment different from so many others was that it wasn't just about David. It was about every black person who had faced similar injustices, but hadn't had their stories recorded, shared, and amplified. For every General David Carter, there were thousands of names the world didn't know, names that had been lost to history, buried under systemic oppression. David knew this movement wasn't about him. It was about something far bigger. He became a symbol, yes, but more importantly, he became a voice for those who had none. And with that voice, he began to advocate fiercely for systemic reform. One of the first initiatives David led was a national task force aimed at overhauling policing policies across the country. Partnering with legal experts, community activists, and even former police officers like Kyle Thompson, David's task force focused on creating new standards for police conduct, emphasizing de-escalation techniques, racial bias training, and accountability measures. He was determined to see real change, not just in his community, but across the nation. David traveled tirelessly, attending town halls, community meetings, and public forums. Wherever he went, people gathered to hear him speak. His presence alone was enough to command attention, but it was his words that stirred something deep within people. He spoke with the calm authority of a military leader and the passionate conviction of a man who had lived through the very injustices he sought to dismantle. At one such town hall in the city, where he had been wrongfully arrested, David addressed a packed auditorium. People from all walks of life filled the seats, young and old, black and white, activists and skeptics. The air was electric with anticipation as he stepped up to the podium. He began his speech by recounting the day of his arrest, not as a moment of personal grievance, but as a reflection of a much larger, more pervasive issue. "I am not here today as General David Carter," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "I am here as a man, as a father, as a citizen of this country, standing before you because I know what it feels like to be judged not by the content of my character, but by the color of my skin. But this movement is not about me. It's about all of us, about every person who has ever been treated as less than human because of their race. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "We cannot afford to wait for change any longer," David continued. "The system is broken, and it is up to us to fix it. Not through violence, not through anger, but through action, through policy, and through holding our leaders accountable. We must demand more from those who serve and protect us, and we must demand more from ourselves." As David spoke, the room seemed to shift. People who had come simply out of curiosity found themselves moved, inspired to be part of something bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about reforming the police. It was about rebuilding trust, about creating a society where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. David's leadership had an undeniable impact. His task force began drafting proposals for legislation at both the state and federal levels, and politicians from across the country took notice. The momentum was building, and soon several states had passed new laws requiring comprehensive racial bias training for law enforcement officers, the use of body cameras in all interactions, and independent oversight committees to review incidents of police misconduct. In the midst of all this, Kyle Thompson continued his own journey of redemption. He had been speaking at small community gatherings, sharing his story of growth and change. It wasn't easy for him, standing in front of people, admitting his mistakes, and owning up to the harm he had caused. But it was necessary. Kyle knew that if he wanted to contribute to the solution, he had to be transparent about his own role in the problem. He wasn't looking for sympathy or forgiveness. What he wanted, more than anything, was to help prevent others from making the same mistakes he had made. He began working closely with David, offering his perspective as a former police officer to help shape the reforms they were advocating for. His insights were valuable, and though it was clear he still struggled with the weight of his past, he channeled that struggle into something productive. One of the most powerful moments came during a large community event organized by David's movement. It was held in a park near the police station where David had been arrested, an event that symbolized both the pain of the past and the hope for the future. Hundreds of people gathered, and at the center of it all was David Carter, standing tall as a symbol of resilience and leadership. As the crowd settled, David took the stage and began speaking once again about the need for unity, justice, and reform. He spoke of the progress that had been made and the work that still needed to be done. But then, in a surprising moment, he called Kyle Thompson to the stage. There was a brief murmur in the crowd as Kyle, visibly nervous, walked up to join David. The two men stood side by side, one a symbol of justice, the other of redemption. For a moment, the crowd wasn't sure what to make of it. David turned to the crowd and said, "This is what change looks like. Not in grand speeches or sweeping gestures, but in the small, difficult steps we take to acknowledge our mistakes and learn from them." Kyle Thompson made a grave error that day, but he has chosen to face his actions head on. He has taken responsibility, and more importantly, he has committed himself to being part of the solution. Kyle stepped forward, clearing his throat. His voice wavered slightly as he spoke. "I can't undo what I did," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I can't take back the pain I caused General Carter or the distrust I created. But what I can do is change. And that's what I'm here to do, to change, and to help others do the same. The crowd was quiet at first, unsure of how to respond. But then, slowly, a ripple of applause began to spread. It wasn't overwhelming or thunderous, but it was genuine. People understood the gravity of what they were witnessing. A former police officer standing alongside the very man he had wronged, both working together toward a common goal. As the applause grew, David and Kyle shared a brief glance, a silent acknowledgement of the long journey they had both traveled. It was a moment that encapsulated everything David had been fighting for, not just justice, but the possibility of redemption, of real, meaningful change. In the weeks that followed, the movement continued to gain momentum. More cities adopted reforms based on David's task force recommendations, and conversations about race, justice, and policing became more mainstream. It wasn't easy, and there were still many challenges ahead, but the tide was turning. People were starting to believe that change was not only necessary, but possible. David knew that the work was far from over. The fight for justice was ongoing, and there would be setbacks along the way. But he also knew that progress had been made, and that was worth celebrating. In the final months of the year, David was invited to speak at a national summit on racial justice and policing. Leaders from across the country gathered to hear him speak, to learn from his experience, and to take inspiration from the movement he had helped ignite. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces before him, David felt a sense of pride, not just for himself, but for everyone who had contributed to this moment. "We've come a long way," he began, his voice steady and strong. "But we are not finished. The fight for justice does not end with a few laws or policies. It is a fight we must continue every day, in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces. We must stand together, not as enemies, but as allies, in the pursuit of a better future for all." The applause that followed was thunderous, but David didn't dwell on it. He knew that applause was fleeting, that the real work lay ahead. But as he stepped off the stage, he allowed himself a moment of reflection, a moment to appreciate how far he had come. From the day he was wrongfully arrested to becoming a national leader in the fight for justice, David Carter's journey had been one of resilience, leadership, and hope. He had transformed a moment of personal pain into a movement that touched the lives of millions. And though the road ahead would be long, he knew that he would continue to walk it, side by side with those who believed in a better world. David's journey wasn't just his own. It was the journey of a nation striving to live up to its ideals of justice, equality, and freedom for all. And though the challenges were great, so too was the potential for change. Together, they would continue the fight, knowing that every step brought them closer to the future they all deserved.